got Dr. Luke Gartlan now with us. Yeah, while you led up the presentation, I'll just briefly introduce him. He has actually come down from St Andrews, have you?
Yes.
Today, so and there was a 2-hour delay on the train apparently, so we're lucky we didn't have to wait 2 whole hours. But anyway, so Dr. Gartlan is a lecturer in the School of Art History at the University of St Andrews and is the editor of the quarterly journal History of Photography. But he particularly has written quite widely on Japanese photography. And this book that we're launching today is one that we had a particular interest in because we actually gave a grant to help with the publication of this, feeling that it was particularly important. And since your slides are now up and running, shall I hand straight over?
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
Why not? Thank you so much for the invitation. Of course, thank you to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation for its support. The grant came at a very critical moment. These days, to get grants towards helping for images for books, particularly for art history, is a real boon. So I'm very thankful to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation for its support for this book. So I suppose what I want to do at this stage, I gave a presentation in Australia a few months ago, and I decided on that occasion not to talk about the book, to talk about something else. And then at the end of the paper, someone came up to me and said, "What you just spoke about, was that in the book?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Oh," and walked away disappointed. So on this occasion, I'm going to give a much kind of broader overview of some of the themes and interests that came to me in studying this figure, and why I feel working on figures like this is important to understanding late 19th century Japanese culture, but also not Japanese visual culture, also what the West is thinking about Japan at the same time. So, let's see if I can... Right. So to position what I do compared to what's been happening in Japanese art history more broadly, I would think that when I look back on what I've done, I'd describe it as down-up history. I work with families, with private collectors, with those who think, "Why have you come to see me?" As opposed to working with necessarily the major sorts of institutions of the state, major national collections, and so on. So books like, which I always found a bit, I mean, these are very good and important books, but they are, I think, very much about the kind of governmental structures of the Japanese at the time, what the Meiji officials were doing, for instance, in bringing in ideas of museums into Japan at the time, or of bringing in sort of state ideas of how to teach Western art history or Western art in Japan. So these sorts of projects, I think, have been very much about sort of looking from above downwards. And the project I'm interested in, working particularly with a merchant who lived in Yokohama, is about the kind of personal, the private, the familial, and not forgetting this, but how in fact that inflected these sorts of relationships to, for instance, the larger power brokers within Japan at the time. Okay, so there he is, seated in the middle. And so straight into an example of this. This is from the family descendants in Vienna, who, unfortunately, I mean, when I met Bernhard Stillfried, who's now deceased, he told me that, "Oh, it's terrible, so unfortunate. I remember the cameras. They used to have them before the Second World War. They had all the glass negatives and everything, but it was bombed." And then he said, "Unfortunately, we only have this box," and then opened up a box and almost sort of died at the amount of material there was, in sort of half a dozen different languages from all over Asia and so on. And there was this, and it's a lovely example, I think, of what a photographer at the time, particularly travel photographer in Japan, requires. The large plate camera behind, the darkroom apparatus to develop on the spot on the far side, and of course the convivial company with the obligatory bottles to enjoy the trip, and all the assistants, all the Japanese workers to carry all the equipment. And this is a picture I think will go on to question this sort of model of a Western photographer in Japan at the time, being comfortably in control, which I think is how he wants to present himself at this time. All right, so for those who are unfamiliar with his work, this is a sort of representative example of what made him famous around the world. So a little potted biography. He's born in the same year as photography was supposedly announced to the world in Paris in 1839, and dies in 1911. He's an aristocrat who seemingly had a few problems with his family and ran away rather romantically. He fights in Mexico for Maximilian, and eventually makes his way to Japan for a first visit in around 1863 to 1865. He's working as a diplomat and reporter at that time. And then he returns in 1868. And then from 1868, leaves around 1881, goes to Thailand, goes to Hong Kong, and so on. So off and on, he's in Japan for about 20 years. And these are crucial years of transition for Japan and for how the West sees Japan. So these are the sorts of works that he began selling to Western tourists coming through Yokohama, where he set up his studio in the mid-1870s, and that he exhibited around the world in world exhibitions at the time. So it had a vast impact on how the West perceived Japan at the time. So this is Yokohama, photographed in 1872, with the railway station front and centre there, brand new and recently opened. To give you some idea of one of the so-called treaty ports where Westerners would establish themselves and set up their businesses or trade or act as diplomats or missionaries or whatever it might be. With all the, at this stage at least, all the prosperous ships in the background for the trade that's going on. So Yokohama is obviously crucial to this story. Established as a treaty port in 1859 where Westerners could live and trade. From the very beginning there were photographers who arrived in Yokohama seeking a new opportunity. And these were of obvious interest to the Japanese as well. One of the earliest to arrive was a very famous photographer, Felice Beato, who'd already made a name for himself in Crimea, photographed in the aftermath of the Indian Mutiny. In the Second Opium War, he took a number of photographs there as well. So he arrived in Yokohama only 4 years after the port had opened, with an established reputation, but soon realised that he could do quite well in Yokohama and established a series of sort of conventions that became known in more recent literature as Yokohama photography, Yokohama shashin. And what characterises that is a business, a sort of trade model which is primarily understood to be for export. These are primarily photographs which are being marketed towards Westerners. Right? So there's been a number of exhibitions in recent years around these photographs, and they're creating a sort of dichotomy which I'm a little uncomfortable with, I have to say, between Westerners who seemingly are active in Yokohama and who are selling to other Westerners, almost like it's a kind of closed circle. Right? And then on the other hand, domestic Japanese photography, right, which is seemingly more located in Tokyo, in places like Asakusa, Nihonbashi, and producing photographs primarily for a local Japanese audience. And I think this model is just too neat. It doesn't actually understand how a figure like Stillfried crossed over constantly, and the other way around, how in fact Stillfried was a useful go-between for Japanese photographers. So increasingly as the project went on, yes, it's very much about trying to outline Stillfried's career and a model of what his importance is. But it's also very much about trying to establish what his position was within an expanding understanding of what photography could be within Japan itself. So Beato starts with this sort of model. They're hand-coloured, of course. This has almost become an obligatory signifier, a marker of what makes a Yokohama photography, for it to be hand-tinted. And indeed, Westerners at the time felt very much this way about it. So in the 1890s, looking back, an anonymous correspondent wrote about how well Beato did, and it just seemed like he'd make money selling whatever you photographed. I'll let you read this yourself. And it gives you a kind of sense of the opportunity that this industry availed itself of, but also by the 1890s that now only humble followers, neither are there any merchant princes but only merchant slaves. So there's a certain sort of cynicism a few decades later about the success of photographers like Beato. And then in Tokyo, to take a model, this is a figure I'm very interested in, Samuel Cocking, because he's Australian. He set up a supply shop advertising in Japanese, providing photographic equipment to these Japanese photographers in places like Nihonbashi and so on, and said that he had no fewer than 180 photographers as customers on his books. So here's a good example of how crucial these Westerners are. Samuel Cocking, interestingly enough, when I started working on him, there was virtually nothing written, particularly in Western languages, absolutely nothing on him, which suggests something about how these figures just sort of have been lost they fall between the cracks between a sort of understanding of them as Westerners or Japanese. Cocking converted to Buddhism, he married a Japanese, he died in Japan, lived 45 years there, ended up living the last 20 years of his life on top of Enoshima, the island outside, and they've renamed the park there after him. So he again is sort of representative of the role that these Westerners had in the emergence of this industry. All right, I'll just move on from that. And this, I think, is I'll be talking about this in a month or two, but I just thought I'd put it in as an example of what I see as, in fact, a competitive market, not just a competitive market between Japanese photographers and Western photographers, but a kind of competition about how to represent Japan. All right, so here we have Felice Beato establishing the kind of language of what becomes known as Yokohama photography, hand-tinted, incredibly theatrical, a kind of mixing of different forms of representation. So you have, for instance, a stone lantern here represented in paint, but then actually put into the studio as well. And the woman looks off camera, she seems, as it were, not to engage with you, and so on. On the far side, at exactly the same time, this photographer, Shimazu, established his studio in Yokohama, and was seemingly producing a series of genre photographs, which in this case were sold to Westerners. But his image of Japan, I think, is fundamentally different. Strips, takes out the backdrop, simplifies the composition, almost deadpan in its aesthetic. And I don't see that as necessary. It's a kind of response to what photographers like Beato are doing. And what we forget, I think, is that in fact Yokohama was therefore the established point for both Japanese and Western photographers. And they lived very close to one another. They, of course, knew each other's work. So there is, I think, a lot of exchange between their work. All right, so that's around 1870, the first decade of Yokohama photography. And this is the point, around 1870, 1871, when Stillfree establishes his studio in Yokohama. I think it's important to note that there's no evidence that Stillfree knew anything about photography before he arrived in Japan. Right? And often that's just missed. It's just assumed that Westerners came with cameras in their luggage and knew everything. I think that's also important because if you rethink that, what that means is that Stillfree learnt about photography in Japan. And therefore I want to kind of rethink him as a product of the Japanese photographic industry himself, as emerging from that world. He came, of course, with particular knowledges, being an Austrian aristocrat, but his kind of enthusiasm and interest, his training, all took place within Yokohama seemingly. And this was a very opportune time to set up your studio, because in 1869, the Trans-American not only had a revolution taking place in Japan, of course, the Meiji Restoration, but within a year, the Trans-American Railway was completed, and the Suez Canal was opened. And suddenly, you could travel around the world. This is Jules Verne in 80 days. Right? And Yokohama goes from being this point at the ends of the earth for Westerners, seemingly, to being a crucial nexus point. It's absolutely central. It links the west coast of America through to the Suez Canal and so on. So suddenly all these Westerners start coming to Japan, not to make money, not to sell silk or trade in tea and so on, but to spend it. They come as tourists. And in the local nomenclature, what the Yokohama Westerners called these tourists coming through were globetrotters. So one of the things I found out in my research was that globetrotter was actually a word coined in Yokohama, and then it went from Yokohama to the rest of the world. Again, a kind of linguistic, we don't sort of think of Japan contributing, as it were, to the English so readily, but there's, I think, a great example of it. So Stillfree is therefore, and has been understood for a long time, as a photographer who is selling his products to globetrotters, and in a sense satisfying what they want to see of Japan, what they want to understand of Japan, which is why we end up with this sort of understanding of him, which is certainly important, of him producing images which cater to a kind of fantasy idea of Japan. Now, why, however, do I see it important to look very carefully at one photographer? Well, I think Stillfried makes us sort of rethink the sorts of relations between Japan and the outside world at this time. So firstly, often these histories, and we're in Britain, they concentrate on the major treaty power nations when we talk about cross-cultural. So it's France, it's Britain, it's America, even Russia. Austria was very late to the day, and often Austrians are just subsumed, particularly in Anglophone literature, into being Germans, right? So we lose a kind of sense of their specificity, and in fact, how that particular area, that particular relationship could be different. I feel quite strongly being Australian about this, because Australians are often assumed to be British at the time, right? And so a sense of Japan's relationship to another Pacific emerging nation state at the time is really a history which has just been lost. So that's one first methodological issue. The second is that merchants are often just dismissed. They're just assumed to be there to make money, right? And a sense of them actually becoming engaged with Japanese culture and becoming closely married in, even into families, is lost as well. But in fact, you know, they're merchants, right? What they require is business contacts. And many of these figures stay in Japan for decades. They learn the language, they marry into Japanese merchant families. So I'm interested in the role that these merchants had in the kind of, in the arts world in Japan more broadly at the time. So the figure I mentioned before, Samuel Cocking, for instance, seems to have been one of the first collectors of cha no yu as a Westerner, or hot tea objects. Extremely unusual at the time. And then thirdly, commercial photographers, these figures that I'm talking about like Stillfree, they travelled incredibly widely, both within Japan and abroad. So although I said he spent around 20 years in Japan, there's not a single year that he's not going somewhere, including overseas. I mean, I think in that 20-year period he went around the world 5 or 6 times. So there's a methodological problem here, that how do we deal with figures like this who travel so much? Because they come in and, if you, for instance, just concentrate on Japan, as a Japanese art historian, for instance, they come in and out of focus. You know, suddenly they're overseas for 2 years and they come back again. So there's a problem here about how we position these sorts of figures. And certainly one of my major interests in him was to think about a career that became possible, not through just travel, but where travel was actually integral. And that's both to him as a photographer, but also to his market, because the majority of his market are tourists travelling as well. What that means, of course, in terms of the archive of Stillfried's work, is it is everywhere around the world, and there's nowhere one place you can go to see it all. It's in Melbourne, it's in Tokyo, it's in, you know, it's just dissipated. It's a diasporic archive. Right? So again, we have a great deal of historical difficulty understanding what the significance of these figures is, because of the way in which art history divides geographies into particular areas. Alright, so what am I doing? Well, I've just said that I'm interested in these photographers as private in terms of their network lives, as opposed to their kind of official role. Secondly, therefore, the archives go with that. I am interested in official archives, but bringing them into dialogue with private collectors and with family archives. Many of these albums I've looked at have been in families still to this day. And there's an emphasis on the non-canonical, on the sort of material that gets forgotten. One of the reasons I became a photographic historian. But more broadly, an interest in not just photography itself, but also the role of these commercial photographers in a whole host of other fields. Right? So I think if we just deal with their photographs, that's obviously important to what they were doing. But you'd be surprised with how many fingers in the pies these figures had. Right? They were involved in all sorts of chaperoning, for instance, figures around Japan, showing them the sights, acting. I'll show you in a moment. He went so far as to take a tea house to Vienna, the whole thing, 7 rooms, and reconstructed it in 1873. So they're involved in all sorts of different cultural activities, which we might call visual culture. So to just understand them as photographers, I think, loses sight of those other aspects of their career. He was also involved in selling curios to Westerners, so-called curios. So a lot of Japanese art objects more generally were being sold through these photographers to visiting Westerners. And finally, I'm interested in the shifts in their life. I'm not interested in sort of saying this is who Stillfried is and he remained that way for the 20 years that he was there. I'm interested in how their careers could actually, and their attitudes could change at the coalface of cultural exchange. All right? So we'll go through some examples, hopefully, of that. Okay, so issue 1. These are, I suppose, the kind of broader issues that I was hoping to kind of pull out from the book, kind of stepping back from it or from the detail of it. So issue 1 I've called Attributions, Archives and Authorship Matters. So Attributions. On the far side is a photograph by Felice Beato of Nagasaki in 1868, and on my side is a Stillfree photograph from 1872. This is a bit like Where's Waldo? Can you spot the difference? I am almost certain, I mean, firstly, we now know that Stillfried was taught photography by Beato. But I'm almost certain that for Stillfried's first work around Japan, his landscape work, he almost had a Beato album. I thought, wow, I just sort of... This is not an industry which rewards innovation. It's an industry which rewards, as it were, sticking to particular sorts of images and understanding of Japan. So attribution problems with Stillfried are endemic. They are all over the place. Here's another example, a very early Stillfried photograph. And the vignetting, that sort of fading around the edges, has almost been taken as Beato, but it's certainly not. So unfortunately, this is a huge problem in Yokohama photography. Because it continues, I mean, it's every single time. So one of the things I wanted to do was actually provide a strong basis for actual attribution, as rather nuts and bolts as that sounds. I think it's important to establish a foundation for instance, thinking about other photographers, including Japanese photographers, right? Because a lot of Beato's work has, in some cases, been attributed to Japanese photographers. Right? Now, it's particularly disturbing when they talk about a Japanese view of Japanese society when you know it's a Stillfree photo, and vice versa, right? So we really do need to have a firmer foundation for the attributions of these works. So this is, for instance, a photograph by what I'll talk about, one of his assistants who went on to become a major competitor, a Japanese photographer by the name of Soui. But it also is representative of the different archives aspect I was talking about. This is from Andrew Carnegie Birthplace Museum in Dunfermline. When I say these are everywhere, they really are. But they're not necessarily in the Victorian Albert Museum. Right? They're in geographical societies, they're in public libraries. I found an album in a secondary school in Austria from the 1870s. You know, they're distributed across all sorts of different archival materials, and that's the case in Japan as well. So how to go about establishing a kind of foundation? All right. Now these are, in the end, the four major frontispieces from Stillfried's studio over the 11 years that it ran, from 1871 through to the early 1880s. And the two on the far side are the earliest two. And the two on my side are really deceptive, because this is a frontispiece from 1877. He's been a photographer for 6 years. But in fact, the partner here who is mentioned in Anderson actually bought out the company in that year. right? Meaning that in fact, all albums that have this frontispiece, Stillfried actually wasn't involved in. What's occurred, therefore, is that his name has become a kind of brand, something to be traded and sold. And one of the problems that's occurred in the literature is that scholars have seen the word Stillfried on a frontispiece and go, oh, that's Stillfried's work. Right, whereas in fact it isn't. The only two that are these two, which are much rarer, much more difficult to find. And to show you, and so this is the issue of authorship. That was the third of my A's in this topic. You'll see down the bottom here, I'm going to argue that authorship is not something that art historians just apply to these photographs, but it really did matter to photographers at the time. And where that's shown is down the bottom here on this frontispiece, which is mid-1870s, and there's only 4 albums in the world with it. It's extremely rare. It says on this side, printed and published by Stillfried and Anderson. Stillfried and Anderson as like a partnership, as a company, right? They printed the work. But on this side, it says negatives by Baron Stillfried. He was the photographer, right? Now this is extremely rare in the 19th century, to actually have a distinction made between the photographer who's responsible for the content of this album and the company that sold the album, Stillfried and Anderson. So why would you do that? I think you do that when you begin to become concerned about holding stock, as it were, your property, right? Because already in the 1870s, Stillfried is constantly being undermined by competitors, by officials, by potential competitors and so on. So that he wants to, as it were, hold onto this material. And what goes with that as well is that there's been a vast simplification of what Stillfried's work is, which is sort of representative of some of the examples I've shown so far. The other aspect I wanted to do was diversify, in fact, what he did, as opposed to what the studio or the company sold. So this isn't, I won't go, this is in the book as to why he did this. But on the far side is, can you tell, it's underneath all that paint is this photograph, right? Now, when I discussed this with specialists initially, they just assumed this was a badly tinted photograph, a badly coloured photograph. In fact, what Stillfried, he called these works photocrayons. For him, they were a separate genre altogether. Right? A very over-painted photograph. And likewise, he's not been known as a painter or watercolourist at all. But there's an example of one of his watercolours on the far side based on one of his photographs here. There's a lot of interest in Japanese, particularly in the Japanese literature, in kind of crossovers and links between photography and painting, whether it be Western style or Japanese style, and these crossovers. But here we have Stillfree doing exactly the same sort of interest in crossover. So again, that's been an aspect of his work which has been entirely lost because his watercolours just haven't been found so far. All right, second topic, overlooking modernity. Now this I think is really a crucial one because, as I suggested, Stillfried's work is so much about creating a kind of fantasy idea of Japan which is understood to be timeless and outside modernity. So to argue that Stillfried's work actually shows modernity in it, but we just overlook it, raises a question about what actually his work was in Japan and how we understand it. So it's not surprising for me that this is a very early Stillfried landscape. That is unattributed. Well, of course it was unattributed because it doesn't fit Stillfried's, the idea we have of this photographer's work, right? But this is representative of some of his earliest work, and it's a bit difficult to see here, but there's a figure here in a bowler hat and with a Western style umbrella and high heel shoes, leather boots, and the figure over here is wearing leather boots as well. So you have actually a kind of streetscape which is showing the reality of what Japan was at the time, which was that there was a kind of mixing of Western style clothing and Japanese style clothing. And Stillfried has no problem showing this. Okay, now if his photographs are supposed to present a timeless idea of Japan, this does not fit that idea. Why take a photograph like this? Likewise, it's really intriguing that we think that a photograph is taken and it's set, that's it. but photographs are changed and manipulated through the years as well. So on the far side is a photograph taken, again, very earliest work, first 6 months to a year of his studio, and he's called it, in a very esoteric manner, La Bella Española. Anyone who knows that, I think one or two might, but a really unusual title to call a photograph. And on my side, 3 years later, he's cropped it, he's cut it down to get rid of the title, right? And this is called Kawasaki Tea House. All right. La Bella Española was the name that the Germans called, what the British would call black-eyed Susans. She was believed to have been a woman at a tea house between Yokohama and Tokyo, who, when Charles Richardson was attacked by samurai in 1862, she supposedly came and helped him as he died. And so for Westerners, she was seen as, you know, you were thankful to her. And she was called by the Germans La Bella Española. So this has a very particular actual history within the recent history of Japan for Westerners who live in Yokohama. But of course, when tourists, globetrotters come, they have no idea about this history. What does this title mean? So when Stillfreed's market shifts to being primarily globetrotters, what does he do? He crops the title, right? So in a sense, what begins as a group of photographs very particular to Japan and to other Westerners who live in Japan becomes a more generic series. He's responding to market change with the work. Again, looking at this as a photograph, this looks nothing like what you would expect of a Stillfree photograph, but I'd argue this is probably the most important photograph he took in a lot of senses. For all the wrong reasons, you could also say. In the centre of the photograph is Emperor Meiji. This is his first visit, his first public appearance ever, to the Yokosuka Arsenal, just near Yokohama. And he went there to sort of give a stamp of Meiji authority to this westernising initiative. And it's a very unusual photograph because if you look at it closely, you realise that a lot of figures do not realise they're being photographed. They're turned away from the camera, right? Or if you look in other aspects, it's been highly retinted because people have moved, right? If you look in the foreground here, there are ropes. So the question becomes, how was this photograph taken? And how it was taken was the ropes go to a ship which is in dry dock, and Stillfried had his camera through a hole in the sail. This is like an early paparazzi photograph. But of the Emperor Meiji, can you imagine? For him it would have been a great scoop, of course, the first photograph of the emperor. But it caused a massive scandal because when the Yokohama governor, who was 27 at the time, but would become the foreign minister to Japan, one of the sort of really Machiavellian Japanese diplomats of the 19th century, Figemutsu Munemutsu, when he read the newspaper, you can imagine him being really shocked. He then instigated a series of legal manoeuvres to put pressure on the Austrian authorities to block this photograph. And in fact, British police turned up at Stillfree's studio and confiscated the negative. So it was believed that that had been entire, and this seems to be the only print known. This is with a private collector in Japan now. Within a month, that photograph was taken, and the following year that photograph was taken. Now for Japanese art historians, this photograph is entirely forgotten, this entire story, and these are the two that matter, right? But what I'm arguing in this book is, in fact, this photograph was crucial to prompting these photographs. Because at the end of the report about the scandal, one of the newspapers says, look, what's the point of censoring this photograph? The next time the emperor appears in public, there's going to be 50 photographers there. So how did they short-circuit that, the Meiji officials? They hired their own Japanese photographer to take an official photograph of the emperor. Right? And to, in a sense, break that desire. And these became the official images of the emperor. In the literature, particularly the Japanese literature about these imperial photographs, this is the story that's put forward, which comes from the kind of official account of the Emperor of Japan, published by the Imperial Household Agency in the 1960s. And it mentioned on the 1st of January 1872 a commemorative photograph, Kinen no Satsue. But it doesn't, it was taken at Yokosuka, but it crucially does not say who took the photograph. It provides a description of the photograph, and that's all. Right? In May, June, the ambassadors who were involved in an overseas visit to America and the US came back, Ito and Okubo, and they presumably asked the Imperial Household Agency for photographs of the Emperor. And then in September they said that, the same account says that Uchida had photographed the Emperor. So based on this sort of authoritative source, Japanese art historians have assumed that it was the return of the two ambassadors that precipitated the need for a photograph. And that's their account of it. But putting in the new materials, which are highlighted here in the green, 2 weeks after the commemorative photograph, Stillfreed's premises was raided and the negative was taken. And before the end of January, there's an account in a Western newspaper in Yokohama saying the Emperor gave a sitting on Thursday week for a native artist. Right? So, what I'm suggesting is that this official account is somewhat duplicitous. It's trying to separate the Stillfried scandal from actually the photographing of the Emperor by Uchida. But that when you put in the new material, it's quite clear that there's a chain of responses here taking place. And that we need to therefore understand these imperial photographs in light of Stillfried's particular event at Yokosuka. Just to show you, though, how things can quickly change. Before the end of the year, the Japanese had hired Stillfried, even though they were disgusted. And he obviously annoyed a lot of people taking a photograph of the Emperor. Ultimately, you get a feeling that need wins out. And if he's available, they'll hire him. So in preparation for the Vienna World Exhibition the following year, a lot of Japanese photographers had been hired to photograph what the Japanese government were doing around Japan. And so Stillfried was one of those, and he was hired to go up to Hokkaido and to photograph and give a sense of what the Japanese were doing in quote-unquote colonising Hokkaido and making it part of Greater Japan as it would emerge, unfortunately. So these two photographs, which are really intriguing, were never actually sold by Stillfried to Westerners. They were produced as part of this commission for the Japanese government, and they are in Sapporo, the only prints I know of. And they're of Hokkaido Jinja. It was absolutely brand new, 6 months old, and it had reinstated 3 gods, which were to do with the colonisation of the land and of prosperity and so on. And so they're, in a sense, hiring Stillfried for their own political purposes, is the point. At the same time, Stillfried didn't arrive there with no idea. He'd been there in 1868. This is a map he did of Japan on his first visit there. So he did know something about Hokkaido. And he produced some of the earliest photographs of the Ainu as part of this commission. This one I think is really intriguing because here's the Ainu on the donkey and he has 2 Japanese in front of him. This is the only photograph of a kind of mix, of a mixing of the Ainu and the Japanese together. And overlooking modernity. So this is the sort of classic problem, I suppose. This is a photograph looking towards Hakodate, which is the major port for westernisation in the background. And it's sold as a photograph for Westerners. And I think for a Western audience it might say something in particular. It might say, you know, a kind of distant, untouched land. Right? But in fact, if you can see through there, there's a kind of line, a scar through the land. That is the new road linking Hakodate to Sapporo. Right? And that's why these trees are down here, because they've been felled. So in fact, from a Japanese government point of view, it shows the infrastructural work that's taking place. Right? So a photograph that we might look at and go, how, you know, distant and so on, is in fact, I argue, a photograph which shows Stillfried fulfilling the commission of the Japanese government to show the work that's been done And in that sense, it is a photograph about modernity. It's a photograph about the changing landscape of Hokkaido in particular at the time. Likewise with this photograph, where you look at two figures there and you think, well, doesn't it look rustic? Well, in fact, these are the so-called soldier farmers who were emigrating into Hokkaido under a government scheme to farm the land. Right? So again, there's a sort of sense here of development and of progress and so on. Easily missed, I'd argue. All right. Okay, so histories that escape photography. So I suppose this is about the issue of what else photographers did. And so, just as one example of that, the Vienna World Exhibition takes place next year, 1873. Remember, by this stage, he's only been a commercial photographer for 1 year. He's been rather busy. And he pulls apart a 7-room tea house and ships the whole thing to Vienna. And this is, in fact, the tea house in the Prater in Vienna, with two of the figures who he hired on contracts. And this is the kind of top-down issue I was alluding to. There's been a lot of work on the Vienna World Exhibition because it's really important to how it was the first opportunity the Meiji government had to promote itself as a government around the world overseas. And so there's been a lot of work in terms of the official displays, how it fulfilled kind of diplomatic purposes, his Sissi, the Queen at the time, being shown, the gardens and so on. The problem is that Stillfree is nowhere to be seen in any of this work at all. And that's because his exhibit was not actually in the official display. There's a sense that his exhibit was competition for the official Japanese government exhibit, so that he got pushed out of the official exhibit. The Japanese exhibits, the official ones, were down here in the main building, whereas Stillfree's exhibit was actually right over here on the other side, outside of the enclosure. Down opposite here, outside of the actual exhibit. And accordingly, it had a kind of impresario aspect to it. And he lost a lot of money. He actually returned to Vienna almost broke from this experience. And here's another view of Stillfreed's tea house itself at the time. So this is not, if you just concentrate on Stillfried the photographer, this is a sort of aspect of his work which is sort of lost. But they cross over with one another. Because he's selling in this tea house Japanese objects. He bought ceramics and fans and so on. He was selling them to the Viennese. And he was also, apparently the inside of the tea house had his photographs exhibited in it. Right, so I think we actually need to rethink how we understand commercial photographers. That they weren't just in one particular area, the photographs they produced. They were doing all sorts of different activities. Okay. So this is a particularly famous photograph of him in his Yokohama Studio in 1875, at the height of his career. And at his feet is a Japanese assistant. And I think this is a bit of a fantasy of his. I think this is how he wanted to believe his position, in authority, at the centre of things, surrounded by all the paraphernalia of a successful studio, but pretty much in control. Whereas, in fact, as things went on, and clearly he taught a lot of Japanese photographers. So one of the things I wanted to actually document were who these were, to at least begin the process of showing that they weren't in isolation, that they had a role in teaching other Japanese photographers as well. Many of these are quite successful commercial photographers at the time. And you see that crossover when you compare his work to other photographers. So Chamakh Revenge is particularly famous. There was a major exhibition of his work last year in Tokyo. And lived around the corner from Stillfree, 2 or 3 blocks over. And I don't think it's accidental, that caption, the style of it. I think that Chamakh Revenge knew Stillfried's first portfolio. And in fact, that photograph is in a Stillfried album, because presumably the collector bought the Stillfried album, walked around the corner and then bought a few Chamakh Revenges and stuck them in the back, just to show how close they are to one another. Another example of how close these networks are. All right, the Stillfried on the far is the first photograph. Note the painted background. 2 years later, Michael Moser, you wouldn't believe it, another Austrian photographer in Japan at the time, he arrived in Japan at the age of 16, in fact, and worked as an interpreter for the Japanese at several world exhibitions. You can see he's swiped the background. Can you see that? It's the same background, right? And then around the same time, Uchida, the photographer of the emperor, produces a series of kabuki performances, and it's the same background again. Now this is not 3 different backgrounds, this has been shopped around from studio to studio. So literally material and personnel are going between Western photographers and Japanese photographers. And then Soui, I think I'll go through him quickly, I think is, in the book at least, the great example of a photographer who really annoyed Stillfree, who clearly did so well that he undermined Stillfree's own business authority. So I argue that he was an assistant in Stillfree's studio who left and set himself up as a competitor against him. So this is 1875, one of his first works. He advertises in English, right, sort of showing how ambitious Japanese photographers are for a Western market. And in response to this advert, it was understood as a challenge because the Tokyo newspaper said, Stillfree and Beata, they can't just let this go. This is a challenge. So it was understood from the beginning, he's setting up a studio, that this was a direct confrontation and competition with Stillfree. He's advertising in English guidebooks, Westerners to buy his work. And then he produces works which I think subtly undermine Stillfree's image of Japanese photography, because a photograph like this has a Western style carpet, a Western style chair, mixed with obviously traditional aspects of Japan. It works within a certain discourse within Japan, but then if you look at the kanji on the lapel, it says Usui. It's like an advert to the studio itself there at the same time. And more extraordinarily, and this is one of my favourite photographs in the 19th century in Japan, the far side, it's an extraordinary photograph of a Japanese woman in Parisian crinolines with a fascinator on and ostrich feathers and so on. It's not just the subject and that she's dressed in Western clothing, it's the iconography of it. In a rondelle side on, it's very sort of Renaissance portraiture. So that if you think at the time that the Impressionists in France were taking inspiration from Japanese woodblock prints, here you have a Japanese photographer in Yokohama around the same time taking inspiration from Western style art and bringing it into his work. And I think if you put Usui's work next to Stillfree at the same time, you get a kind of confrontation. You become aware of, in fact, how fabricated Stillfree's image of Japanese womanhood is. All right, shifting allegiances. This is one of the last, and this is begrudging and accepted, I suppose. So suggesting there is Stillfree that he has to adapt his own practice to what's occurring in Japan. And that also concerns his views of Japan. So from being a photographer who got himself in serious hot water photographing the Emperor of Japan, within a few years he seems to be representing the Japanese. So in this case, for instance, there was a bureau called the Inshokyoku, the printing bureau. It was part of the Diet at the time, and Stillfree was being commissioned to provide equipment to them. This is in 1874. I'll skip that. The printing bureau becomes particularly important in promoting an idea of Japanese art goods around the world and presenting an official view of what Japanese high art is. What's been missed is that Stillfree taught there and established the photography wing of it for the first 6 months of its existence. And that many of the Japanese photographers who would then go on and photograph many of the most important objects in Japan were taught directly by Stillfree. The best evidence, and this extraordinary document, I think, was 5 years later Stillfree's in Thailand, and he writes to King Chulalongkorn to suggest the same business, the same idea of a printing bureau for Thailand. And he gives, I think, an almost word-for-word description of what the Meiji government's purpose for the printing bureau was. He says, that, look, this can have manifold uses. The rich treasures of antiquity and monuments of Thailand, which are still concealed from modern science, could be made accessible. You can promote your cultural values to the West, basically. 2, the raising of popular education I've mentioned. 3, the cheap fabrication of portraits in colours of illustrious persons. If you think about the spread of the emperor's image in Japan through woodblock prints, through lithographs, he's suggesting that you could do this, King Chulalongkorn, your image, and you think about where that is in Thailand now, the king's image is everywhere. And here we have Stillfree suggesting the benefits of this sort of establishment. So from being a commercial photographer, a Westerner, who's going out to produce images to sell to Westerners, within a decade, he's suddenly, seemingly, working for Asian elites to help them establish themselves on a global circuit. And Stillfreed's therefore sort of shifted his position here. He's become an advocate for these elites within Asia. Alright, so finally, to finish up, he returns in 1883. And I find it particularly intriguing that in the year, after almost 20 years away, returning to Vienna, he produces this self-portrait, the only self-portrait we really have of him. And if you looked at it, you'd barely know that he spent 20 years in Asia. Yeah? There's no image here of a Westerner dressing up in Japanese clothing to look exotic. What's the point of that? The only thing he has, just there, is a little kanji sign for thunder, which I've never been able to work out what it means, but that is the only thing, just to show that he spent 15, 20 years of his life in Japan. One thinks you do this sort of work and you do it in a kind of vacuum. It's in the 19th century. But then last year, as the book was coming out, some people in Wagga Wagga in Australia contacted me and said, do you know that Stillfried had 3 Japanese children, which I did know, and they went to Singapore when he went to Vienna. Well, my husband's directly descended from them. And we've got some material, and we don't talk to another wing, but they're in Perth. And I mentioned this to the family relative in Vienna, who said, oh, we had another person in the Netherlands who knocked on our door one day and said, hello, we're the family descendant of. So the projects I'm working on now actually are very much about families and about photographs, as opposed to this kind of official commercial photography. But I hope I've given you a kind of sense to argue that Stillfried's not just a photographer producing works for a Western audience, that he's deeply enmeshed in the kind of politics of the Meiji state at the time as well. All right, thank you.